Welcome to Deborah Middleton, who's travelled down from the Lake District to be with us for this very special event in Victor's memory. The idea for today's event was conceived immediately after Victor's funeral just over a year ago, when Ken Robinson, David Airey and Malcolm Wood put their heads together to imagine something that would be a fitting memorial to Victor's wide range of achievements, and of which Victor would have approved. Something a bit more appropriate than a memorial service. Subsequently, Ken approached the Tourism Consultants Network to ask us if we would manage the event, and of course, we were delighted to get involved. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Pam Foden and Rebecca Hawkins in particular, for their diligent work in helping to pull the many threads together, not least this morning when we got an unusual number of last-minute amendments. I'd also like to express our particular thanks to the university for so generously hosting us in this excellent venue. Finding an affordable and conveniently situated conference venue in London is not easy. Indeed, it was key to making this event a success. So we very much appreciate the university's collaboration, and I'm delighted that the Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Peter Bonfield, is here this evening to say a few words. Thank you also to Lindsay Hanford and James Morgan on the teaching staff, who've been so helpful with the arrangements. A lot of people have expressed their regret not being able to attend tonight, including former Tourist Board colleagues of Victor's, Jonathan Jones, Philippe Taylor, Richard Denman, David Phillips, and our old friend Chandra Sonpal of the BTA Research Department, who wrote to say, "I first met Victor in 1973, and we kept in touch until he died. He has touched the lives of hundreds of students, teachers of tourism, consultants, and government experts on tourism. And as for myself, he would always make a point to talk to me on research and other matters, and was a very warm personality. I wish the organisers and others a successful evening, reminiscing about his intellectual contribution to the British tourist industry." A warm welcome also to the students of tourism who are here from both Westminster and the University of Surrey, where Victor was instrumental in setting up the first tourism courses in the UK in the 1970s. I hope you'll learn something from our eminent speakers that will give you ideas and inspiration for your future careers in this infinitely varied and constantly evolving sector of activity. This evening's programme is divided into two parts. In the first, 9 speakers will look at the areas of the tourism sector in which they specialise and in which Victor took a particular interest, and examine briefly how these have evolved in the past 50 years, from the development of Tourism Act 1969, which is roughly when Victor's career began. The second part will be a discussion panel led by Ken Robinson, where our speakers will look at trends in tourism, both in the UK and globally, and try to forecast where things are heading in the medium to long term. You'll also, of course, have a chance to put your questions. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Peter Hampson, has had to withdraw just this morning, having suffered a bad fall yesterday evening that's rendered him more or less immobile. He sends his apologies and greetings to old friends and colleagues. We'll be distributing the text of his presentation after the event. Finally, I've been asked by David Bruce to convey the sad news that Professor Chris Holloway of the University of the West of England, Bristol, author of The Business of Tourism, who will be known to many of today's audience, died at home on Monday following a long illness, aged 85. He would surely have been here this evening to celebrate Victor's seminal contribution to establishing tourism as a profession and academic subject in its own right. I'd just now like to invite Peter Bonfield to come and say a few words for the university. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and a hearty welcome to Westminster. And actually, I'd like to tell you a little bit about this less than well-known venue, in case any, which has, I think, all sorts of sort of tourism potential. So, but actually it relates seriously to our university as well, and relevant for the evening. So, in 1838, I'm Peter, I'm the Vice-Chancellor and President of the university. My job is to run the thing. Anyway, the first one of me George Cayley, was a really pioneering engineer who actually, he developed an aeroplane, he developed flight, but sadly the plane didn't fly because at the time they were still running on steam and the engine was too heavy for the plane to fly. But when engines became lighter, his design was used by the Wright brothers to do flight. Anyway, he was an amazing engineer. He was a philanthropist. He cared about societal injustice, all sorts of things. And he, with a couple of others, decided that the future for Britain in the world was technology. He believed it was all about technology. And he used the word technology back then. And he tried to think, how can I influence Britain to understand and take up technology to the benefit of society and to the benefit of our economy and to the benefit of Britain's position in the world. So he raised some money, and in the hall next door, if you go and look there later, he built a big hall off Regent Street, just north of Oxford Circus, and in that hall he built it to show different technology. The first thing he did was at the far end of the hall, where you can see students playing table tennis probably at the moment, he dug a big hole. He filled the hole with water, and he designed a rudimentary diving suit, rigged a chap up in it, put him underwater, had people on top pumping air to keep the chap alive, and London started coming in to visit, and London thought it was a miracle that a man could stay underwater and do work and not drown. He then linked with some electrical engineers and built a massive great induction coil thing which they wound up, and then they pressed a button every so often and these shafts of lightning and sparks would fly between two electrodes, and Londoners thought it was great. And in one of the top corners on the balcony, he cooked meat without any visible form of fire using reflectants. Anyway, Londoners flocked in, and he started running public lectures around science. But the most important thing he did was he went to the East End of London, he rounded up a load of children, all skinny and emaciated, dirty, dressed in rags. He brought them in, he put showers in, cleaned them up, went to Savile Row, got clothes, and started teaching them good etiquette. And that's where our educational journey began. And in fact, we were the first polytechnic, and we're really proud that we're a polytechnic. A polytechnic is known for its ability to create good citizens with vocational education who go and be great workers. But interestingly, the word polytechnic comes from a hall off Regent Street, where in Latin you could see many, in Latin poly, technologies, in Latin technic. So the word polytechnic, which became an educational word, actually started from that hall. In Greek, it also meant a place where you can learn about many different sciences, but that's it. The second one of me here was Pepper. And Pepper was into optics and projections, and he developed this technique called Pepper's Ghost, which magicians have used in magicians' halls for about 100 years or so, or more. And it gives an illusion of something being there that isn't, using mirrors and clever things like that. Anyway, in 1896, the Lumiere brothers, who developed the cinematograph, the thing where you string together single images into film, they had this technology. They wanted to make money. And because they were techies, they knew Pepper, and they persuaded Pepper to convert the place where we did lectures into a place that showed film. So in 1896, 54 press, politicians, leaders of industry, and general influential people went into this lecture hall to watch the first ever film shown in Britain. So our cinema, which is Two-Away, is the birthplace of British cinema. And the true and famous story there is, it was the first film was of this steam train coming up a track into a station in northern France. And as this steam train appeared to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger to this very loud organ music, two on the front row cracked, stood up and ran out, followed by half the audience. True story. Today we have 19,000 students here in London. We have another 5,000 in our other campuses in other parts of the world. 65% of our students are black minority ethnic. 65% of our students are women, many who we equip with strength to go and work in male-dominated professions and be brilliant. 40% of our students are first generation in their family to go to university, so they don't have those normal confidences that come from a brother, a sister, or a mother, father that's used to it. And for tourism, 25%, in fact 28% of our undergraduates and 40% of our postgraduates come from one of 160 countries in the world. In the world rankings, we are ranked 14th for our international students. We draw people from around the world to London. They go back to their homes, and they're a great advertisement for our country and encourage tourism. Anyway, that's who we are. We're really proud of our tourism management students, our event students, our lecturers, and the work we do around there. We link to sustainability, to cities, to architecture, to sustainable transport. We put it all together into a heady mix of emotion, climate action, creating great places for people to live, and it's part of this sort of wonderful, diverse, inclusive mix that's uniquely Westminster. I also worked on the Olympics. Between 2006 and 2012, I was seconded into the Build programme to co-create the sustainability strategy and to deliver the greenest games. And that really showed me how events, cities and tourism combined can create great outcomes for people. So, isn't it a wonderful place to have an evening event like this? You're so heartily welcome. Anytime you want to have an event, come here. The cinema's great to go. Come to this hall. Enjoy Westminster. Have a look at the hall later as well if you like. Have a really good... Yeah. So, the third one of us, Vice-Chancellors, was Hogg. So Quentin Hogg took over the place. He ran the Young Men's Christian Association Education. He took it over in about the late 1890s, and he was into body, mind and spirit. No, mind, body, spirit. So he did the education bit and was very keen on the sport bit. So the gymnasium there, the old gymnasium, was actually a place that did sport. And I discovered under the carpets and behind the panels, the wall bars were still there, and the sprung floor. So over the summer we cleared all that away. And now you'll go in there, you'll probably see students salsa dancing or something. Anyway, hurrah for you all and hurrah for Westminster. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. We certainly do appreciate your hospitality, and we'd be delighted to come back again. The first of our speakers on tourism is Ken Robinson. I don't need to introduce you to most people in the audience. Ken was a great friend of Victor's and worked closely with him throughout his professional career. Like Victor, Ken is a founding member and past chair of the Tourism Society, past chair of the Tourism Alliance, and past chair of Tourism South East. He was appointed CBE in 1997 and has an honorary doctorate for innovation and leadership in tourism. Ken.
Thank you very much, Roger. What a wonderful place to be in with that story. And, you know, thinking back to the beginning of the train being projected there, and who would have imagined we'd be onto flat screen televisions in every home and in most rooms in this period of time. It mirrors the extraordinary changes in tourism, which is the backdrop to our story tonight of a truly wonderful man. I'm going to start with a little survey. Of those of you sitting down in front of me, how many knew Victor for 40 years? My goodness me. Hang on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 20. Knew for 30? 30 years? 20? And all the rest of you, if you haven't known Victor before, you're going to by the end of this evening. Well, what a story. So Victor once said to me that he was a very lucky man because he was in the right place at the right time. Well, he was, but he had the great talent of inspirational foresight. And my comments tonight are to provide you with a synoptic overview of what I see as being Victor's contribution. Victor grew up in the 1950s in Lancashire, where his parents had a small hotel. And from school he went to the London School of Economics, where he began his career in industry, and thereafter he moved into tourism. I always like this picture on the right, which appears quite a bit tonight, because it's got that cheeky chuckle. I mean, those of us that that knew Victor well. There was the academic side and there was the other side. And the other side was never far away. But it didn't actually show itself when he was being serious. So my sort of subtitle for talking about Victor is that he was a pioneer in the understanding and management of tourism. Which brings me to why we have this title of the event for today, which is the development of tourism, time to act. Why did we pick that? Well, 50 years of completely unprecedented and unpredictable change, which you're only too aware of because of the degree of experience in the audience. But it was not foreseen what has happened. The change of tourism volumes and values and behaviours because of prosperity and technological change, and that's had these extraordinary economic, social and cultural consequences. And that led the Labour government in '69 to passing this act of the Development of Tourism Act, which then shortly afterwards gave birth to the regional boards as well as the BTA and the national boards of Scotland and Wales and England. And it was such a different time then. Butlins and Pontins holiday camps were in their heyday, and they were the most exciting and the best holidays that most people in the UK could dream of. The language was different in those days. Historic houses were still stately homes, and this was before short breaks or budget hotels, and crucially it's before jumbo jets first flew, and international tourism literally took off. Now, I could show you any of various versions of this chart, which most of us in the room know only too well. It's a simple block picture of the change in the volume of international tourism from 1950 to 70 to 1990 and 2018. In fact, the 2018 figures, according to how you do it, are about 10 times what they were in 1970. And to understand the pioneering and insightful contribution that Victor made to tourism over these 50 years, we really have to kind of cast our mind back to before these things that we now take for granted happened. I've spent the last 3 days in World Travel Market. 50,000 people from around the world, 50,000. Saudi Arabia announcing at the Ministerial Forum yesterday they're the last country in the world to open their doors to tourists, to leisure tourists. Just extraordinary. Just extraordinary. So we now know, and I'm just going to put them up here because it's the backdrop to our discussion this evening, what has been the factors that have driven this? Well, it's increasing leisure time and disposable income, the volumes of people that have travelled, the value of tourism to destinations, which has become absolutely critical to the whole development of their social well-being and their infrastructure, the accessibility and affordability of international destinations, which has become ever cheaper, the sophistication of marketing, the expectations of tourists, and of course, it's extraordinary that 20 years ago there wasn't an internet, as far as any member of the public was concerned, really, except for a few emails. Now, it's used for absolutely everything. Perhaps, in fact, the fact that it is trusted as a secure means of commercial transactions by consumers, by trade. Do you remember telex machines? Some of us remember telex machines. How did it ever get to this in such a short time? So, the headings that we have picked out tonight for the speakers that we've got, and I have to say thank you so much to the speakers who have agreed to do this, because there is some serious talent in this room, ladies and gentlemen. These are people that normally command a complete audience in the Albert Hall, but they're here for your delectation tonight, talking about each of these topics, except for Peter Hampson, who's lying on his back, which for a member of the Territorial Army is unusual. Anyway, my next subtitle for Victor's work is that he brought marketing skills to tourism. He was, of course, a statistician and an economist, and that, when he began, was his sort of building blocks of everything that happened. He didn't know about tourism at that time, and he developed his knowledge with the very respected leading companies. First, that giant owner of consumer brands, Procter & Gamble, and then subsequently Gillette. In the days when it was about sales and not about marketing. Marketing was still a very new word. I always thought, actually, that if he'd been selling razor blades, why didn't he use any? But anyway. Victor discovered tourism as his career focus in the late 1960s, when his experience fitted him perfectly for joining the then private sector British Travel and Holidays Association. He went there at the time when Len Licorice was in charge. Who knew Len? Yeah. Hands up. Oh gosh, there's a memory. Anyway, he went there when Len was in charge, and he established in his first role was marketing research manager. And then I think, you know, when the British Tourist Authority was created just after the development of Tourism Acts, his role evolved to marketing policy and strategy manager. And I still think, if you think back to the time, what a clear explanation it was of what Victor was about. There was indeed a head of, I think Sandy will remember him, well, there was a head of research many years later at BTA, who, when I asked him what the figures meant, said to me, oh no, our job is to actually tell you what the figures are. We're not in the position of telling you why or what they mean. I was thought, well, Victor would never have stood for that for a minute. So anyway, at heart he was animated by these insights that he derived from his analysis of the research, and he joined and contributed to something. He told me he was a member of IEST, and I had no idea what it was, and it was the International Association of Scientific Experts in Tourism. And I kind of looked at him blankly, but Victor was turned on by that. Anyway, he was greatly attracted with this sort of serious background to the world of education and academia. And tourism was so embryonic back then that there were almost no textbooks. This seems very odd now, but no textbooks, no training, no university courses, almost. But there was this extraordinarily, the birthplace of in universities of tourism training at Surrey University, that great place. I say it not because David Airey is in the room and he would hit me, but it's true. And they introduced a tourism module to their hotel and catering administration course. This was, of course, set up by Rick Medlick, who was, as we all remember, or most of us do in this room, the most formative person in the creation of the Tourism Society. And Victor worked there for 17 years in one way and another, first full-time and then part-time. And following a student visit to Bewley, which I had just opened the National Motor Museum in 1972, Victor asked me to help him with the Surrey course, and I went there giving presentations and then welcoming students to Bewley. And what he said was he wanted them to see what the real world of the developing and managing tourism was about. And that is when the difference in Victor's attitudes became clear to me. When other people focused on the volume and value, Victor was only really interested in the where and the why and the how of tourism, and he combined data and insights with marketing theory. And to Victor, marketing was not just about making more profit, but about how to make better products and happier customers. He told me that his favourite quote from Cossons, the marketing expert, was that people don't buy products, they buy the expectation of benefits. And I remembered that and thought, I could see this coming out in everything that Victor did. So after those 17 years, and when he'd actually been part-time for quite a long time, he left Surrey University. And if you can read that bottom sentence, he said, these days I find it more rewarding and more stimulating to practice what I preach. He was desperate by that time to stop being an academic and to start getting out into the real world. I see smiles out there from those of us that have struggled to make that work. And here I am with lovely David there on the left, and Graham Miller and Victor at the opening of the Rick Medlick building in 2014, and you see where the cheeky chuckle picture came from. So that was the University of Surrey, and Victor in his great career at the university. But I realised that his academic and marketing talents could be put to good use in my consultancy companies that I'd formed in the mid-1970s after many requests for advice and help. And Ventures Consultancy was one of the first in the field, and our services were in much demand. Victor keenly accepted the invitation to come and work with me on this, dovetailing his work at the university with the consultancy projects. And we worked very, very closely together Victor worked with Ventures on over 70 projects in total for a variety of clients, including property developers, national bodies and associations, government departments, national and regional tourist boards, historic house owners, independent museums, a new term, independent museums, all the time honing his skills in the real world. And because of that, Victor and I travelled extensively. We were all over the place, ending the day in a bar, Victor always had a yarn, and I loved it. It was absolutely great. Travelling with Victor was a real highlight, and some of us that do a lot of consultancy work know how the end of the day can be a very miserable time when you wish you were doing something else, but it never was with Victor. So this was the same time as the Tourism Society was founded. In fact, in 77, in the mid-70s, Rick Medlick was the father of that. And Victor was the secretary of the steering group and truly the engine room of everything that was done to create the Tourism Society. He drafted the Tourism Society principles. He was centrally involved in devising the organisational structure. He set some of you no doubt were in the room at those meetings where Victor would say, well, what I think we should do is, so we did. He defined the society's purpose, which was adopted from then on, enhancing professionalism and linking the sectors. Some of you will remember having been there. This was his message to the members when he first became the council and board member for many years, but then vice chair and chair in 1989 and 91. And then when we had our splendid do at Trinity House, our founding father was back at that great anniversary in 1997 to remind us why we were all there and what we should really be doing. So Victor was absolutely essential to all of that. And then, of course, this is really a milestone in so many ways. I said there weren't any textbook in tourism then. Thank you. 3 minutes remaining. Well, I'll speak faster then. This thing, hands up those of you who read this. Good stuff. Victor will be thrilled. Just think of all those royalties. I mean, Victor's greatest love was royalty checks. But he loved two things, really, academic accreditations and royalty checks. And this wonderful thing, which appears all around the world, went into 4 editions. It was published in all those years. Sorry, I pushed the button once too many. And you can go around the world now and you find students still reading this. It's in its 4th edition. You find, and incidentally at the end of that period, you can see he had co-writers who were adding bits to it and making it even more valuable. But this work has changed the way that tourism has been understood and been managed thereafter. Good for you, Victor. Good for the bank balance. And he also picked up something that Lenny Lickrish started, a book which is really, really very valuable because people forget to write down what happened, when and why. So picking up a really very rough manuscript, Victor wrote this book, The Remarkable Story of Growth. We couldn't agree where the remarkable could go. He said it absolutely cannot be the story of remarkable growth. It's not grammatic. Anyway, I'm sure you're right, Victor. So he wrote a lot, and academic accreditations. I could have, David Airey, thank you very much, David. David is the chronicler of what Victor got up to and did, and I merely copied a little bit of that. But if Victor found something that worked, he liked to really do it often. Do it again, do it again, do it again. And Leaky Bucket really worked. Some of you will remember Leaky Bucket. It first emerged in 1995. He revised it in 2003, and what Leaky Bucket said was to a government and even to a BTA that was really concentrating so much on inbound tourism, overseas visitors to the UK, was that 80% of the volume and value was domestic. And unless you properly managed that, you didn't get anything right. Unless you knew that that's where you should be putting equal effort, it didn't work. So he revisited this, and he also produced an absolutely seminal piece of work measuring the local impact of tourism, because the national statistics were so aggregated that it was not possible to find out what was happening at the local level. And two models were produced, STEAM and the Cambridge model, and Victor worked on advocating those and trying to improve them, and he did that in '96. Then here comes Leaky Bucket 3 in 2010. He kept on sending it to people. They all thought it was new. And he also picked up very, very strongly, and this is the bit that you would have got from Peter Hampson but aren't going to now, on local authorities, destinations and the public realm. He last updated measuring the local impact of tourism is in 2002. So I'm merely going to say, as he's not here to do it, that in the beginning of this time there were some resort publicity officers. They changed over time to frontline, very, very competent professionals. And local authorities were always in partnership with the regional tourist boards and with the private sector. They gave leadership, they had funding, they made things happen. They were focal entities for the collection and the understanding of tourism statistics, and it was used in planning policies and so on. And from that came destination management organisations, although that name was really a misnomer because most of them are marketing cooperatives. Many of them are very fragile and they weren't into management. And then Victor really lighted on this, that public realm responsibilities were critical. And in his later years, Victor became very, very keen on that. And he changed his focus to promoting recognition of the visitor economy. That was Victor doing that. And he then really, really felt strongly that the loss of funding and the withering involvement of local authorities, because they simply couldn't afford to do it, was a major failing in the way Britain managed tourism. Victor was also very keen on sustainability. I was very surprised to find from David's absolutely wonderful record keeping that Victor organised the first conference on tourism and the environment in 1972. Imagine that. Extraordinary. Major conference in London. And then people got worried about destroying the very places that people had come to see. And then Geoffrey Lipman, who's with us tonight, Geoffrey's initiative to set up at Oxford Brookes the news centre there that there was, which no doubt we'll hear about more, so I won't go on about it. But then Victor wrote with Rebecca, who's here tonight and talking, the book on sustainable tourism. Victor had an absolute passion for accuracy in statistics. It drove him bonkers when people didn't do it right. He worked with government departments. He led something called the Joint Industry Council for Tourism Statistics. He was on every government group and he spent hours and hours trying to make people understand that it really mattered. And in his last couple of years, Victor became extremely passionate about redefining the core tourism terms. You'll find them on the Tourism Society website. There were 7 of them. He believed that they had to be better understood. He said, you cannot manage what you cannot measure, and you cannot measure what you first adequately defined. And those were his 7 terms. Look on the Tourism Society website if you want to understand how to understand it better. So that's him, Victor. So much of his work was recognised that in 2005 he was appointed CBE by the Queen. Victor then he disappeared, he became the Sage of Cumbria and went to live with, up in Low Nibthwaite, where he discovered one of the greatest joys of the Lake District, Deb. So he married her. And I have no hesitation in saying that Victor told me several times that the happiest years of his life, because I always thought it was tourism, but it wasn't. It was being in Cumbria with Deb and being in his sports cars and climbing on the hills and doing all the other things they did together. And you know, he was the most wonderfully inspiring chap that I know all of us feel very, very carefully about. And we revere the memory of Victor, who led us through this maze of opportunity and made so many things happen. So what are we doing tonight? Why are we saying time to act? Well, this. That chart's not going to stop. And this isn't going to stop. So what do we do? Last weekend in the colour section, there was a section called Interesting Maps of the World. And one of them was this. And it said, there are more people living inside that circle than there are living in the rest of the world. And then I thought about what I know of tourism statistics and where people come from and where they go to. And when you think of that, it frames the question for the rest of our and Victor would have liked to have solved this. Victor would have been thrilled, I know, that this is the thought that I leave you with. That the challenge for the next 50 years will be to progress from marketing, which Victor did so brilliantly, to management, to optimise the social, cultural and economic benefits of tourism. That is me finished as the background to what you will now hear from the topic speakers. I do want to read you one thing that I've read to some of you before. I know I have no time left. Thank you for waving the thing. This is me. Victor was a dear, respected and greatly appreciated friend. He was a decent, trustworthy man. He treated others with civility and lived by traditional values in a world where these qualities are sadly dimming. He was a distinguished pioneer in the understanding and the management of tourism. Wasn't he a great person to have been in the midst of us for all those years? Thank you very much, and I hand you over now to our first specialist speaker.
Thank you, Ken. I'll accelerate if I possibly can. Grahame Senior is our next speaker. Following a career in writing and television production, Grahame founded his own agency, Senior King, which specialised in targeted marketing in leisure, tourism and travel. Selling the business in 2005, he then founded Senior Partners, which continues to operate in strategic brand marketing for leisure products and destinations. He is an Anglican minister and also runs a boutique hotel, Howard's House. Yesterday, I happened to Google Senior Partners, and the first search result brings up the following information. The Senior Partners were a mysterious cabal of tremendously powerful demons, also known as the Wolf, the Ram, and the Hart. They were the masters of the interdimensional corporation, Wolfram and Hart. In many ways, they can be seen as the evil equivalent to the powers that be. Grahame, it's all yours.
I think I probably wrote that last bit with a tongue in cheek. No. Right. So we're using, which are we using? This one. That's me. This is my first slide. You've probably seen it before. You've probably read that before. And when we were very young and we could see forever, we were quite convinced of the fact that we knew what was going to happen next. We thought we could see forever, and we had so many certainties and thought we knew so much about what was going to happen in our world. Were we right? Well, long ago, really quite a long time ago, when the world was young and so was I, Victor and I met in Wales. That's Wales. That's a picture of Wales that's very famous. Lovely castle, lovely view, lovely weather. And we met and got together, and this isn't working. Yes, it is. We first worked together on a tourism campaign for the Wales Tourist Board. And we developed this thing, Wales, It's Magic. Very clever writing, founded on very deep research, and of course very expensive graphics. It actually was very successful, because it did what Victor was always very keen on, which was it kept people staying in Wales and going back to Wales and not going much further than the border. And we ran that campaign for 15 years. That kind of timing is unheard of today. Of course, like all young Turks, or whatever you call yourself at that time, I had a kind of my own little brand thing, which was a marketing mantra which I developed, and it was this: fish where the fish are, and use the right fly. And it worked for me, and it actually worked for quite a few clients. So I've always stuck with that, and it very simply means that we are people with dreams and visions and knowledge and a special insight into how things might be made successful, and now and again we'll use a little bit of science and logic to justify it all, to give it authenticity, to keep it real. My case was analysing the demographics and the geodemographic profiling of markets using ACORN. Can you remember ACORN? Wonderful language of geodemographic profiling. And basically targeting the message to the market. The right fly to the right fish was what we were always after. And of course the tourism market is very particularly suitable for that, because it's about connecting the right market with the right product via the right message, which of course we were good at. There were, however, we were very lucky, because in those days there were many, many routes to market, many ways in which you could actually target the message that you were trying to get across. There were any number of newspapers, millions and millions every day. There was lots of outdoor advertising opportunities. There were lots of retail shops with brochures. There were lots of people that we could persuade. There was television with massive audiences that you could buy and profile. There were all kinds of media which were very important to us. That was then. All those ways to communicate in the targeted way were at a different time. That was a time which we can call BI, before the internet. And time passes very quickly. When anybody arrives anywhere, at any time today, the first question they ask, this is now, the first question they ask is, what's the internet code? Because everything that they're going to do, or have done, or need to check up on, is available through one pipeline, and in one way, and that's there. It's PI time, post-internet reality. Using the internet, you can ask this question, what happened to it all? All these ways to get to the market, all the ways to make the marketing message targeted and special. In 1990, Britain had 15.5 million daily newspapers sold every day, and now the number's just short of 5 million. 1.5 million of which are metro, which is used to sit on train seats. In 1990, the News of the World alone had 5.5 million copies printed every Sunday. That's more than all the newspapers printed today. Newspapers are gone. The internet is everything. Broadcast television is close to gone. So what can we use? Well, we have to use the internet. And the internet isn't just about marketing messages and communication. It's about every aspect of trading. Retail is going. Mothercare emphasised that message yesterday. And print is going. It's all online. So how do we target our message today? How do we make sure that our brand offer comes up, is noticed, and that our right fly gets to the right people? Well, we have to be humble. We're no longer active communicators delivering outbound messages en masse to the right people. We're more the recipients of inbound search messages from our customers. The customers are in charge. The customers are the people who we have to listen to, because they are doing what they need to do themselves. They're not going through intermediaries to the most part. They're actually getting the information they want when they want it from the people that they have learned to trust, or at least see as value. The market's in charge. We just have to make sure that we're in the right place with the right message and get our brand to the front of the queue. We have to keep up. One of the things that Victor said to me quite early on in our relationship, and we worked on many clients in many places, in many countries, is that the future of tourism is change. It's not going to stay the same. And he meant, when he said that, tourism marketing, the future of tourism marketing is change. But it's true of tourism itself. Today, Almost nothing seems too far-fetched. As Ken said, you couldn't predict what's happened in the tourism market over the last 50 years, and you certainly can't predict what's going to happen in the next 50 years. Nothing seems too far-fetched. What is certain is that we have some problems. The world has some very big problems to face. If you're in Delhi at the moment, it's pretty clear what the problems are there. But it's not just Delhi, it's all over the world. Can we make the future clearer? I don't know. Maybe Greta has it right, and maybe we should be doing what she says, which is basically not travelling. Do we need to travel? I think we would all agree that more and more leisure activity is taking place close to home. Whatever it is, whatever kind of consumption, it's taking place close to home. Whether it's viewing things, seeing things, learning things, buying things. Does it need travel? This will come up eventually. Tourism without travel. Well, I said that some years ago to Ken. He thought perhaps it wasn't a great idea. But is it a silly idea today? We don't drive around in our cars as much as we used to. We don't go to the shops as much as we used to. We don't do so many things as much as we used to. Maybe the new zeitgeist in tourism is staying at home and letting tourism come to us. There's no doubt that the virtual revolution is there and is available to us. It's something that we need to use properly to make tourism successful in the modern world. Because the ecological pressures are enormous. The pressures on transportation are enormous. Diesel's already on the way out, petrol isn't long behind, and our car's going to keep being our personal method of transportation for very much longer. Maybe we'll find our city centres become a new Eden in a new world. And what about planes? This is the headline from last week's Times. Ban air miles and stop frequent flyers. Even cruising's got its detractors. Even though you stay in the same place and see the world, it's still a huge user of fossil fuels. But virtual tourism is here. We need to use it. And this is another kind of tourism. In a little town called Bishop Auckland, there's a new experiment going on in a social development of a whole environment so that throughout the year, different things happen in the same place for different markets and keep people coming back and becoming a kind of community of experience, a membership group of tourism and leisure without travelling too far. Zero carbon, lots of fun. Could be an interesting model. Now, in my opinion, there could be a future for tourism without travel, as a leisure business that comes to you and that you use close to home and use in a different way, in the same way that we experience so many things that we used to go and buy and were physical, they now become virtual. I think Victor would have loved it because it fits in with his view that the challenge of the future is something to embrace and not be afraid of. And I think also the world just might be a better place. Thank you.
Thank you, Grahame. Some very interesting ideas. Roger Carter is our next speaker on statistics and research. Roger is an experienced tourism strategist, destination planner, marketer and operational manager who established Team Tourism Consulting in 1997, since when he has managed, directed or overseen approximately 250 projects throughout the UK and in more than 30 other countries around the world. He has worked extensively with UNWTO and its partners, co-authoring many publications and speaking regularly at UNWTO events on all aspects of destination management, marketing and e-business. Before establishing Team, Roger worked for tourism boards at national, regional and city level in the UK including 15 years at CEO level.
Thank you very much for that splendid introduction, Roger. I could have written it myself. I first met Victor on a flight from Heathrow to Edinburgh. I won't tell you the year, although you'll be able to work it out, because I have to say it does seem like ancient history. But I will tell you that the plane was a BA Vickers Vanguard, an over-large turboprop aircraft, known to its regular users as the Vickers Vibrator. I had just been appointed as Research and Planning Manager at the Scottish Tourist Board, and in advance of taking up that post, I was going to a strategic planning seminar in Edinburgh, organised by Lester Borley, sadly recently deceased. Victor was going to the same event, and very kindly, we were going onto the plane at the same time, and he embraced me, befriended me, took a great interest in what I'd been doing in my PhD research, and offered sage advice about the way things worked in the National Tourist Boards. Victor was, as you've heard, in charge of marketing planning for the BTA, a job he performed with great authority under the watchful eye of said Len Licorice. I liaised with him a lot and was immediately impressed by his intellectual rigour on the one hand and his great sense of humour on the other, which was often required when you were dealing with Len Licorice. Victor was one of the main architects of the time series sources of data that we use to this day, particularly the IPS. He was the master of the IPS, and he shaped it to be of maximum value for marketing planning purposes. So we all have a lot to be grateful for him. If I remember rightly, he introduced the concept of trailer surveys, which was an add-on survey for a small number of a relatively small sample, which added a lot of really useful data on different subjects each year. He was and remained, as you've heard, a great authority on sources of data and the way in which they should and should not be used and interpreted. And he was, of course, a great authority on the terminology. He was our guru in all of these matters. As you've heard, after only a year or so after I got to know him, he moved to the University of Surrey. Academia's gain was certainly the National Tourist Board's loss, and I, for one, was very sorry to see him move on, and I never quite understood it. Ken has asked me to reflect on the changes that have taken place in research and statistics in the period since then. In some respect, change has been quite limited. The mechanisms for market research, whether qualitative or quantitative, remain essentially the same. This is certainly the case with the main tourism management measurement surveys, where consistency is, of course, important. However, ad hoc market research also uses methodology that is conceptually the same now as it was then. There's been some tinkering around the edges to reduce costs through telephone surveys, and now increasingly online and mobile surveys. But face-to-face surveys remain the most reliable methodology, whether through home interview or exit surveys as with IPS. So, on one hand, there's a lot, if you look at the market research scene today, that you would recognise. However, in other respects, there have been significant changes. Operational data that is automatically held on computer, relating, for example, to air passenger movements, ticket sales of attractions and events, hotel performance, can be accessed and analysed very quickly, subject, of course, to appropriate permissions and access arrangements. The tools for analysing and presenting computerised data are now far more sophisticated and available at low cost or no cost. But whilst the tools themselves are more sophisticated, the style and presentation and interpretation of data is now much more readily available. Research results and reports can be disseminated much more quickly through online distribution, and webinars provide an inexpensive way of presenting results to a large audience. Psychographic profiling and segmentation of markets has provided another dimension to segmentation based on values for better understanding of market motivations, decisions, and requirements. There are now huge multinational online consumer panels that can be used to identify quickly suitable samples for market research. For example, people in target market segments, or people who visited a destination within recent years. And then the actual research through online surveys can be undertaken extremely quickly, within literally a matter of days. Such a big change. Interestingly, for these huge panels, international panels, the panel members are paid to complete the survey questionnaire. And this, of course, raises very interesting methodological questions that I'm sure would have fascinated Victor. Social media analysis has provided a new, rapid and economic, very interesting way of measuring consumer sentiment towards tourism destinations, individual tourism attractions, hotels, or whatever. So, some really interesting changes that have been taking place over the last 10 to 15 years. And more fundamental changes are on the horizon, particularly with the advent of big data. That is to say, the ability to analyze and make sense of very large volumes of data. Let me paint a scenario for you, where there is a partnership between mobile network operators, credit card suppliers, GDSs, and other tourism organizations that are operating on an international basis. These partners come together. The data that they can make available is brought together, duly anonymized for purposes of analysis. And then it is possible to track in real time patterns of international passenger movement between airports of origin and destination using GDS data. Patterns of movement within a town, a county, a region, or a country, including lengths of stay in each location, directions of travel, and so on, available through mobile data. The amount and type of expenditure in each location available through credit card data. So for countries, regions, counties, towns, and even individual attractions, a dashboard can be constructed to show basic profile data of visitors, a travel volume heat map, hourly, daily, weekly, monthly patterns of travel, types of expenditure, and even economic impact data. A huge range of information to enable better informed destination planning, management, and marketing. Now, if all of this sounds somewhat fanciful, well, actually, it's already happening. It's happening in Spain, in Buenos Aires, in Shanghai, in Hangzhou, and I'm sure many other leading destinations around the world. Now, of course, it's not easy. It's not yet comprehensive, and it's hugely expensive. But costs will come down in due course, and such systems will become commonplace in 10 years' time, providing in real time what would have taken huge surveys and long periods of analysis to provide through traditional methods. In the meantime, tourist boards can set up sensors and video cams and start to gather their own monitoring data in real time and access other readily available sources such as satellite images, which are particularly valuable for analysing volumes and patterns of those attending outdoor events. Tourism Northern Ireland is a real pioneer in this respect. So this is a highly dynamic field, one which I'm sure Victor would have relished and subjected to that academic rigour that I mentioned earlier. And I have to say that's a rigour that I have aspired to throughout my career. So my thanks to Victor for that inspiration. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
We move from marketing and research into product, and specifically cultural heritage. Our next speaker is Sir Neil Cossons. Neil has enjoyed a lifetime's career in museums and heritage as director successively of Iron Bridge, the National Maritime Museum, and the Science Museum, and latterly as chairman of English Heritage. He was a founder in the 1970s of the Association of Independent Museums, which today represents the interests of over 750 museums, Neil Cossons.
Well, thank you for that generous introduction. It's a rare privilege and a high honour to be here to reflect upon Victor and all his achievements, not only in terms of his professionalism, but also as a dear friend and colleague, and especially so in the presence of Deborah. In the late 1960s and throughout the 70s and into the early 80s, a new museum opened in Britain every 2 weeks. In the middle part of the 1970s, the Ministry of Works was taking what we would now call an ancient monument into the captivity of the state on average every 2 weeks. Now, much of that is history. There is no Ministry of Works. The quasi-privatisation of heritage into now the two bodies, English Heritage and Historic England, means that the willingness and enthusiasm for taking things into the care of the nation means that it might be one every 2, 3, or possibly 4 years, rather than one every 2 weeks. Now, those little statistical insights are part of the premise of an area and of a professional enthusiasm which Victor occupied, and which was broadly speaking outside the control of any of us as participants or professionals. And it was Victor who was able to cast some light on trends that he saw at a time when most of the rest of us couldn't. The 70s were the great heritage years. That was not driven by the state. That was not something which the tourism industry promoted. It was the reaction of the public to seeing changes to its surroundings taking place of which they disapproved, and they wanted to act. And there were popular movements in favour of preservation of buildings which only a few years previously would have been regarded and despised. So we've occupied the last 30 or 40 years in the framework of big social and cultural changes which led people to value their past, and as local authorities and the national government, by their reckoning, weren't doing anything about it, they took the law into their own hands and set up their own museums. And the Association of Independent Museums, which was set up in the 1970s, was a means of bringing together the 500 or so independent museums as they then were, and it's now something in the order of 1,000, and 700 plus of them have their interests represented in the Association of Independent Museums. I remember David Seckers, then the director of the Gladstone Pottery Museum in Stoke. He and I sat in my office in Ironbridge, and we dreamt of how we would set up this association. We didn't know what it would be called. We thought it would be something to do with museums. We were convinced it would be something to do with independent, and Association of Independent Museums, AIM, leapt off the page. It was the shortest and quickest branding exercise in history. And AIM has thrived, and many of the museums that AIM represents are brand leaders in terms of the public and the museums that that public visits, and much of that is based upon the light which Victor cast upon the business of independent museums as he saw them. And it was reflected in 2 books. The first one, New Visions for Independent Museums in the United Kingdom, published in 1990, and became a handbook for anybody who was involved in running a museum, mainly independent museums, but other museums as well. It was known as the Little Red Book, and Victor was the maltretant behind it, bringing both the intellect and the power and energy and restlessness that was one of his great characteristics. And he brought focus and he brought professionalism. And AIM set up a little working party chaired by Nigel Home of KPMG to bring the dozen or so key professionals in independent museums together with Victor. The committee was set up in some way to provide guidance for Victor. In the event, it turned out to be the committee which Victor lectured, tried out ideas on, tested his ideas, and so on. He drove the committee, and we all sat in awe-inspired silence. AIM liked it because not only did it inspire independent museums, bringing an element of professionalism to add to their unremitting enthusiasm, which had led to their coming into being, but because it cast a new light on what museums could be in terms of their subjects, how they could relate to their publics, and indeed how independent museums could start to influence the wider environment of museums, which were largely, of course, in the public sector. Such was the impact of the Little Red Book that in 1998 AIM thought it needed to do the job again, and Victor was the obvious choice of the analyst and author. New visions for museums in the 21st century. The word independent had disappeared. Such was the impact that independent museums had already had by then, that AIM thought that its ideas, that is Victor's ideas, could cast light on all sorts of museums of whatever stripe, of whatever scale. And that was part of the relationship which Victor established with independent museums as a subspecies, and museums in general, and the heritage sector as larger brands and species too. Now, what Victor brought was immense charm, infectious enthusiasm, a restless and unremitting energy. You couldn't sit him down in a room and ask him a question, partly because he would have already asked us the same question before we'd thought of it, and secondly, that having got that question into the debate, it would form the basis for 20, 30, 50 minutes of discussion, in which the light that he brought onto the debate was something which was awe-inspiring on the one hand, and an immense pleasure on the other. He was recognised within the museums profession and also within the wider heritage profession as somebody who needed to be a part of your planning, your strategy development, and your thinking. And much of that he did with as a consultant, and much of it he did simply by talking over a drink in a pub after a day's work. He recognised too that this uncontrolled growth of museums in the 60s, more particularly in the 70s and into the 80s, meant that the number of museums grew, but the average number of visitors to those museums halved in that time. Cannibalisation of the visitor sector and the visitor market and segmentation meant that people who liked the idea of setting up a museum because they were enthusiasts could get away with it while they could attract numbers and extract income from those numbers. And Victor understood the relationship between an oversaturated market, in terms of there are more museums in theory than there are people to go to them, and yet the business thrived and continues to thrive as a result of those key issues that Victor identified, which he incorporated in those two books, and which were part of the light that he cast upon the debates of those museums and heritage attractions that took him into their bosoms, either as a consultant or as just part of their growth and part of their thinking. He had his enthusiasms. I remember a heritage visit to Poland in which we had to pick him up and carry him bodily out of the room where the pole dancer was providing some form of entertainment. Neither he nor I had ever seen a pole dancer, we managed to cool him down a little after that. He would visit me in Shropshire from time to time too, and offer a ride in one of his scary sports cars. Now, there are two problems here. One is I was sure I was going to lose all the skin off my arse the second he started. But the other one was dashing through these Shropshire lanes where the car was being brushed by the bushes simultaneously on both sides. He couldn't see round the corners. I certainly couldn't. I just prayed that Shropshire was its normal underpopulated self and there wasn't something coming the other way. And he loved it. I didn't dare look at the speedometer. It would have been too terrifying a prospect. So we've just heard now that there is a sort of hinge point. Greater was the picture that perhaps symbolized it, about volume, about growth, about the whole basis upon which our Western economies have been so fundamentally founded in the post-war years. Tourism and the tourist industry will be hated as much as coal mines are hated today. We can't base our futures on growth, unremitting growth. It has to have some other formula, and the idea that we stay at home and the tourism experience comes to us is one of the options. And one particular sadness, I think, in being able to reflect on everything that Victor added to our thinking during his life is that if we'd had the pleasure of his company for another 10 years, he'd have got his teeth into that debate and given us a vivid picture of what the tourism of tomorrow in this challenging new environmental, climate change-based economic environment would be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. A fascinating talk. I'm very glad to see our next speaker has emerged out of the ether. We were beginning to wonder if he had lost his way. But anyway, Geoffrey Lipman is president of the International Coalition of Tourism Partners and founder of Green Earth Travel, a global think tank network. He was Assistant Secretary General of UNWTO for a number of years, Executive Director of IATA, and first President of the World Travel and Tourism Council. Currently, he holds visiting professorships at a number of universities in the UK, US, and Australia, and is a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council.
Sorry, Roger, Geoffrey's just looked in because he gets his credentials twice. It's actually David next.
Oh.
So, sorry, apologies.
Excuse me, let me jump back. Yeah. Thank you, sorry. Okay. Coming back to Professor David Airey to talk about tourism. David is Emeritus Professor of Tourism at the University of Surrey. Before retiring as Pro-Vice Chancellor in 2014, he had spent most of his career involved in education for tourism and is the author of a number of books and other publications on this topic. David first met Victor in 1973 and worked with him at the university from 1975 to 85. Subsequently, they worked together on a number of projects as well as joining together for hiking and hill walking expeditions. David.
Geoffrey just turned to me and said, "That's the best introduction I'd ever had." I could, of course, pretend I'm Geoffrey, couldn't it? But I think that would be impossible. You would see the join somehow. Now, I've taken as my topic, as you can see, keeping tourism education's feet on the ground. And there I have got some feet on the ground, and the feet on the ground is one is a metaphor for what Victor did in tourism education, those feet. But those muddy boots, who are, incidentally, they are not Victor's feet nor Victor's legs. I suspect they're a lady's legs, and I'm sure Victor wouldn't be very happy if I'd tried to pass them off as his. But they're also, for me, a reminder of the many, many hikes that we did together and in hill walking, and which Victor continued to do until, I think just before he sadly died, he was still hill walking. And it's a reminder to me of the many times, happy times we had. Now, I've only got 2 slides, that's one of them, and the picture does actually appear later. Before I embark on that, it's just to say that Victor spent an important middle part of his career, as far as I interpret it, as an academic at the university. I think he was a different person from that experience at the University of Surrey. He joined the University of Surrey in 1973, when tourism education was absolutely in its infancy. There were then, I think, 20 tourism students in the UK. I've got some figures that will come up later. During his 15, 16, however many years he was spent at Surrey, tourism education went through a phenomenal change, possibly a change even greater than the changes in tourism. I want to talk about Victor's role in that, because he was in that process at a very, very formative time, and he set an important direction for tourism education, which to a large extent tourism education still follows. He identified some of the problems which other speakers this evening have talked about, and he did the same thing in the world of education, and hence was extremely influential. I first met Victor in 1973 at the so-called Crisis Conference, which was called by the British Authority in response to the first oil crisis. Perhaps some of you were there. At that time, Victor was working part-time at the BTA and part-time at the University of Surrey, where he was involved in developing and teaching on one of the first tourism programmes that had started in 1972. At the time, I was working for an incoming tour operator, having completed the first tourism programme at the other university, which was Strathclyde. I can't recall what we spoke about when we met, but he made a big impression on me, and he actually opened my thoughts as to what education for tourism was all about, and that there was growth and developments taking place. And I subsequently joined Victor at Surrey in 1975, and this was at the start of a very long association with him, at the start of this amazing development of this particular branch of education. When the first degree programme started, as I've said, there were just 20 students at 2 universities in the UK. There are now 9,000 students at a huge number of universities. And I was in China 2 weeks ago. There are 1,000 tourism programs in China. I was at the Guilin Tourism University, which has got 15,000 students at a university which is just for tourism. Now, in Victor's lifetime in this world, he went from a place in Britain which had 20 students, I think at the University of Surrey, and there's somebody here from the University of Surrey who was on that very first course, I think they had 12 students. To think that now in a part of the world there is a university with 15,000 students, my word, there is a huge change. Now, to understand and try and position Victor's place in this, and to understand what has happened and how Victor managed in this world, there are actually 2 dynamics which were driving tourism education. The first dynamic was the tourism sector itself, and others have already said. Tourism itself was developing fantastically fast over this period, and it was also becoming increasingly professionalised, it was becoming increasingly recognised by governments, and it was also, issues were arising about tourism. I mean, the stirrings of the issues about sustainability, the emergence of the need for marketing techniques, the emergence of the need for professionalisation, climate change, a whole range of different things were happening in this interesting, complex world of tourism. And with his close links to tourism, Victor was actually very well positioned in the world of education to assist in this process. The second dynamic, which is the dynamic which anybody working in universities will be very familiar with, is the world of higher education was also going through a massive period of change. It was, like tourism, was growing very, very rapidly. The figures I quickly pulled out, in 1960 there were 500,000 students in higher education in the UK. By 2010 there were 2.5 million. I suspect, I couldn't quickly get the figures, I suspect it's 3 million now, students at universities. At the same time, there was also some important changes taking place, a lot of initiatives which led higher education to become far more competitive than it had been throughout its history. And it's possibly, competition isn't quite the right word, it's rivalry between universities. Rivalry between universities for students, rivalry between universities for research funding, and rivalry between universities for general recognition. And the ability of tourism as a new area of study was extremely interesting to providers of higher education in the 1970s and the 1980s, because those new universities who were wanting to recruit students, because money follows the students, the number of universities offering tourism grew and the number of tourism students grew. But these same initiatives also pitted one university against another, which has taken its most prominent expression in terms of league tables. And universities have become obsessed by their position in league tables. And you get your position in league tables really by two things. One is you attract the very best students, and secondly, you get the research funding and the high quality research outputs. Now, that is the dynamic of higher education. That's what drives higher education. That's what drives people working in higher education. That's how they're measured, that's how they're valued, that's how they get their promotion. And it sets up a very interesting challenge in universities for a subject like tourism, because tourism, in a way, did not cope terribly well in this battle between universities, because it wasn't every university that was attracting the very best students. It was certainly, as far as tourism is concerned, not all tourism research was good research, was not valued highly, and hence it actually led to really quite a change within the university system, as all universities tried to occupy the same ground of having high quality research and high quality students. Now, it's this dual dynamic where Victor played such a key role by, to go back to the title of this, keeping his feet on the ground, because in that world, from the very starting point when Victor joined the University of Surrey, the first programmes that he was involved with, and indeed helped to create, were specifically designed to be relevant to the world of the tourism sector. And we've heard from Ken earlier today how he brought his students down to Bewley, and also that engagement that tourism had with the tourism sector, introducing his students to the tourism sector, played a very, very important part in a way which was relatively new in tourism, and he clung on to that as being the important contribution. So that was the beginning of Victor's big role in this world of tourism education, keeping the feet on the ground, both the feet on the ground in the tourism sector and the feet on the ground in the education sector. As the dynamic of the education sector began to hold sway, there were inevitably tensions between academic relevance and tourism relevance. Here, Victor continued to play a key role. To some extent, this was exemplified by his activities in the then Education Council of the Tourism Society, and I was a member of that council, and I remember our many, many debates in that council about how best we ensured that what was going on education was meeting the genuine need of those members of the Tourism Society who were employing students who were coming through that education. Victor was absolutely a champion of that, and actually played a very important part in the development of the Tourism Society from that perspective. This is also, this bringing of education and tourism together found expression in his work in 1993 in the preparation of the influential study that he prepared for the Council for National Academic Awards, known as the CNAA. This review of tourism studies degree courses began to point to the curriculum for tourism, straddling both academic and industry elements, which in turn laid the foundations for what we now refer to as the benchmark statements. And now all universities operate with benchmark statements, all subject areas have got benchmark statements, and the benchmark statements set out what students can legitimately expect if they study those subjects. Well, Victor's work, through that influential report that he chaired the group that prepared it, and he wrote the report, that report actually laid the foundations for those benchmark statements, which are still used today. And I'm so struck by other speakers who have stood here, and I'm sure there'll be more who speak after me, who point to something that Victor did, like the AIM booklets, which we've just heard about. And this review of tourism degree courses is exactly the same order of Victor putting a particular view, a well thought out view, as to how this particular world of tourism education should develop. Now, that went on, after that review, went on for Victor to take the lead. It was his initiative to set up something which was called the National Liaison Group for Tourism in Higher Education. Liaison there meant liaison between education and industry. He created that, he set it up, he chaired it for the first few years. Subsequently, it's had other chairs. It is still in existence. It's now called the Association for Tourism in Higher Education, and it's the subject association for tourism in the university world, and it still has an emphasis on maintaining links between education and industry. And in other words, Victor's role was above all about bringing the voices of industry and education together, and he continued this throughout his career. A final example is his outputs, his academic outputs, also have that close bringing together of academic knowledge, not just for its own sake, not just to appear in an academic journal, but to do something for the world. And I think the book that has already been mentioned, the book that he did with Rebecca Hawkins, is exactly in that same mould of when sustainability became an issue. The book that Victor and Rebecca put together is very much about how sustainability can be used by the tourism sector at a very early stage. I can't remember the year of its publication. It would have been in the early 1990s. Now, the tensions between industry and academia have not gone away. Any academic across the world will explain the extent to which their success is measured above all by research outputs, notably in academic journals, and representatives of a highly competitive tourism sector will often be critical of the relevance of what they see of the university world. To some extent, the two sides have drifted further apart since Victor's time, yet at its heart, the issues are the same. Tourism is a dynamic and deeply interesting social, economic, environmental activities that needs a well-educated and trained workforce. At the same time, tourism provides a fascinating and challenging subject for study. So on both sides of that divide, there's huge pluses. One is it's actually dynamic and growing. Secondly, it's very, very interesting to look at. From this perspective, I'm sure Victor would have recognised that the tensions between industry and academia in tourism are as solvable for the next generation as they were for his generation. Tourism is worthy of serious academic study, and indeed its multidisciplinary and multi-method nature may make it an ideal preparation for a super complex world. Tourism, for its part, is a key component of this super complex world, grappling with issues as wide as climate change, artificial intelligence and terrorism. The big question now is how are the academic and industry silos to be kept closely engaged with each other? That was the issue that Victor addressed with a great deal of success during his career. He laid the foundations for those two working together, and like the previous speaker, it would be great if he was here for the next 10 years to actually enable and keep those silos working together. Thank you.
Inevitably, we're running somewhat behind schedule, but we'll move on quickly to Rebecca, who has been mentioned already, who's going to talk on sustainability. Rebecca started her career with the World Travel and Tourism Council, which is where she first met Victor, who was her boss. She describes Victor as a brilliant mentor who subsequently became a good friend and helped her to navigate a career in which she has made input into many of the policies and programs that have shaped the sustainable tourism movement. Rebecca now works regularly for large companies such as TUI and Virgin, as well as international conservation organisations, travel trade associations and charities. Rebecca has recently been elected to the committee of the Tourism Consultants Network.
I'm going to start by saying thank you to Ken. He's offered me a youth tonic tonight. The brief was that we should start from 1969 and the Development of Tourism Act. I was genuinely in nappies in 1969, so I feel positively young. I feel honoured to be here. I feel honoured to call Victor a friend. I've been asked to talk about sustainability in my office, often referred to as the S word, because we often receive emails or telephone calls from people saying, apologies, I will. I'll lean forwards. I think I might be a bit tall for the microphone. We call the term sustainability the S word in our office. It refers to clients who phone up and they go, got a bit of money left at the end of a project. We'd really like to do something with sustainability. We think we should be in sustainability. To which we retort, what would you like to do? Oh, we don't really know. Just make us sustainable. Hence, it's become known as clients who are dealing with the S word. I did actually read the Development of Tourism Act before I came. It was a thrilling read, I have to admit. And I think the thing that hit me about it was the optimism phrased within it, and the fact that it really was about the growth of tourism. At the point at which it was developed, few people in policy or other tourism circles seriously contemplated that we'd be in a position in which there was 70 million or so travellers in 1960 would have escalated to 1.4 billion today, and an anticipated 1.8 billion by 2030. And that's just people who travel internationally. Doesn't count day visitors, doesn't count domestic visitors. In response to the huge success of tourism, we've seen a huge change in mindset, reflected by many speakers tonight. The attention among policymakers is shifting away from looking at measures to support the growth of tourism per se, to looking at ways in which tourism flows can be better directed, managed and distributed, to ensure they don't quite literally kill the goose that lays the golden egg, a phrase first coined by George Young in his textbook Tourism Blessing or Blight, which was my first brush with the academic world of tourism. The concept of killing the goose that lays the golden egg is probably the phrase that best describes my early engagement with Victor. I'd heard of him. Anybody who studied tourism had heard of him. He was an eminent professor of huge standing and many a wise word, but I didn't meet him in the flesh until 1991, and Professor Lipman was a major part in that meeting. At that time, the world was coming to realise the environmental implications of the economic growth trajectory that had occurred largely unfettered since the 1950s. And it was clear that the impacts were significant. In the period 1950 to 1992 alone, carbon emissions globally had already more than doubled. And scientists were already speculating about the impacts that this would have on our planet. With 30 years on, we are now told we have 12 years left in which to meet the targets, and that's well within most of our lifespans. Global water consumption had also more than doubled. If I were a betting woman, I'd say it is the issue of water consumption that will undermine the development of tourism more so than the rather slower impacts of carbon emissions. And this is the thing that really shocks me. the rate of species extinctions had increased fivefold between 1950 and 1992, and that was just of known species. And whilst the warnings of impacts of humans on the natural world had been reported for decades, there was one big difference in 1992 and my first engagement with Victor, and that was that the world finally seemed ready to listen. At that point, for the first time in history, policymakers, business and industry, communities and NGOs were meeting together in what later became known as the Rio Earth Summit to discuss their collective responses to these issues. Geoffrey had the insight to set up the World Travel and Tourism Environmental Research Centre, and Victor was the brave man to become the first director. Many thought at the time it was a poisoned chalice. Just in case you're curious, I've put an update on the board of some of the kind of issues that we are facing over the decades as we go forwards in terms of environmental issues. So in 1992, we knew that the challenges were significant, but there was remarkably little evidence of the environmental implications of ongoing tourism growth. And we all know that Victor was passionate about measurement. Academics, including Young, Krippendorf and Butler, had commented on the capacity of tourism to destroy the resources on which it depended, but there was no evidence. Outside of a few examples in individual destinations or coral reefs, we had no idea of how tourism could reduce its impacts or what the impacts of ongoing tourism growth would be. We didn't know how the world would adapt to the challenge of more people, fewer natural resources and warmer temperatures. So the ambition of the research centre was to start to create knowledge about the scale of the environmental impacts of travel and tourism. Almost uniquely at the time, it was to work largely with businesses rather than policymakers, because it was recognised that businesses had the potential to adapt more quickly to the challenges and to deliver change. The ethos of the centre from the outset was that if it was appropriately managed, tourism could and should be a part of the rationale for preserving natural assets and the communities that depended on them. And this is something that was recognised in those Rio Earth Summit documents. So an early priority was the creation of an evidence base to identify the benefits that could accrue from good environmental practice. Much of this took Victor way beyond his traditional comfort zone. We entered a world of businesses who are engaged in installing light-emitting diodes, kilowatt hours, building management systems, and the ever-so-glamorous wastewater treatment plant. Biological, packaged, chemical, natural. Take your pick. This allowed us to lay the foundations for driving change in businesses at least, simply because it soon became amply clear that good environmental practice was good business practice. The images on the board come from an online environmental management system my business runs as a result of this sort of work, and we soon came to realise that good energy management practices could reduce the energy costs for a hotel by 10% or more. We can now actually segment that down into individual actions so we can predict the likely cost savings and resource savings that will result from individual actions. Good water management practices, again, can reduce the cost base for many hotels by 10% or more. Effective food waste prevention, and don't forget food waste is one of the biggest contributors to climate change, could reduce waste volumes by about 33%. And certainly in some of the experiments we've just been doing with one very large business can reduce food procurement costs by around 5%. When you're talking about procurement costs of many millions of pounds, that is well worth having. Solid evidence of this type was essential. It provided us with the ability to create benchmarks of good practice, you're seeing some on the board, and to understand the processes that businesses need to go to deliver change. And those business processes were really important. Ultimately, this evidence base became the backbone of Green Globe and is also embedded in ISO 14001, the Environmental Management Standard, ISO 26000, the Sustainability Management Standard, and the APTA Travel Life System. So that knowledge has become embedded in driving change, and Victor was behind it. Some 30 years since we first dabbled in these issues, environmental reporting has become normalised. It's something that almost all big businesses do, and many small businesses do it. So it's become a routine practice. And these reporting practices and the processes that businesses have embedded have reduced the impacts of individual businesses significantly. But the progress that we have made with individual businesses belies a deeper truth, and this takes us back to the development of Tourism Act. And that deeper truth is the fact that, while individual businesses are changing their behaviour, the carbon emissions, and no doubt other implications of tourism, we still don't have good data, continue to grow. So tourism, for example, accounts for 8% of carbon emissions. That's roughly 3% more than it accounted for in 2000. So those emissions are continuing to grow. Of course, we see the implications of this increased emissions in the costs that tourism destinations bear, and they also bear the costs of emissions from other sectors. So if we look in 2018, the cost of the hurricanes in the Caribbean was in the region of 1 billion in lost tourism revenues, with a repair bill that's expected to run into 6 million. The cost of the winter flooding, blamed on global warming by many commentators in the Lake District in 2015-16, 19 million. The cost of mass coral bleaching on Australia's Great Barrier Reef will result in about 1 million less tourists per annum, and that's worth about 1 billion Australian dollars. Others have referred to the elephant in the room, and it is the ongoing impacts both from tourism and on tourism that lead us into what is, in my view, Victor's most significant contribution. He recognised that the environmental impacts of tourism could not be viewed as something that could be addressed as a single and isolated issue. To be effectively managed, the environment has to be seen as integral to all tourism. In essence, it's the environment that shapes the culture and the community of a place. It's the environment that creates the desire among tourists to visit and residents to inhabit. Simply put, the environment cannot and will not be protected unless we do something we've been supremely shy of doing, and that's seek to engage those who visit our many destinations in taking action to also protect them. In characteristic style, this was the message of the last email I received from Victor, a passionate call to address the challenges of balancing visitor numbers, resident demands, and environmental protection in his beloved Lake District. And within this last note, he laid out 3 issues that clearly needed to be reconciled, and these are his words, not mine. The first was, surprise, surprise, the need for good measurement, from which to understand that crude numbers can be misleading, and that we have to differentiate between visitors and visits, or between local residents counted as day visitors and those who are staying in paid accommodation. Each of these types of visitors has different economic, social and environmental implications, and we need to be able to tally those costs. The second, no surprises here either, the need for investment in the public realm as the essence on which any claims of world-class quality of the visitor experience depend. But moreover, without investment in the public realm, we cannot undertake the necessary measures to support the development of, for example, sites that can sustain tourist pressure, to take the pressure off more precious resources. And his third concern was one about the blandness of statements that are issued by local authorities who say that they are going to do things like limit the use of private vehicles but have no teeth, no marketing plan, and no realistic mechanisms for implementation. These issues didn't just affect the Lake District. They're common to destinations worldwide, and without adequate redress, they will threaten the future growth of tourism. So this last intervention brings us full circle. As I stated at the beginning, the Development of Tourism Act was about growth. The time has now come to recognise that if we want tourism to create great places to live, work and visit, a claim we often make, then we need to refocus our lens. In this context, Victor would be standing here urging the government to once again build an evidence base from which we can understand tourism for its value rather than for its volume, and that's not just economic value. He would be looking at ways in which the public realm could be sustained so we can deliver excellent experiences for residents and visitors in well-maintained places that have a long-term future. It will be these actions that will be the essence of effective tourism in the future. A tourism that values the places in which it takes place, nurtures the communities on which it depends, and ensures that the tourists are a part of solving the global environmental problems. I want to finish on a personal note. Victor was a man you couldn't ignore. He was warm, funny and mischievous. He had a twinkle in his eye. You always knew when he was about to make trouble, and he made it regularly. These are hardly the characteristics that I had ever associated with an esteemed professor. I owe him a huge debt of thanks, but actually those thanks come from a whole range of people of my age whom he mentored and supported in their early careers. He was my first real boss. I'd had jobs before, not proper jobs. He was my first real boss, and he became one of my greatest friends. When I started work for him, I was naive and I was over-enthusiastic. I was an environmental campaigner. Give me a campaign, I'd be on the streets. Think swampy, I was there. He helped me to learn, A, I needed to get some fashion sense, and B, that I needed to learn the skills of the facilitator, of the negotiator, and learn to work with people rather than fight against them. I'm delighted that he found love with Deb. She anchored him in his beloved Lake District, and she provided something we never thought he would have, an incentive to leave the full-time world of work and to find genuine happiness. She provided stability, and he absolutely thrived with her. He was not, however, a man for whom a quiet life would ever take away his passion to pursue what was right. I understand from Deb that he was campaigning just a few days before he died. And I like to think that in spirit at least he's out there now on the streets, reminding us that tourism can be a great force for good, but only if understood and managed to sustain the assets on which it is based. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I won't repeat my introduction to our next speaker. You've heard a lot about the eminence of Geoffrey Lipman. I'll just finish off by saying he does hold visiting professorships at a number of universities around the world. He has written and lectured widely on tourism strategy, sustainability and liberalisation. He's also served on EU commissions on airline liberalisation and tourism employment. Geoffrey.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe I'll take it back. First of all, I'd like to thank David for, I think, and Ken for involving me in this event. And I'd also like to thank Rebecca, because I've reached that age in life where memory is a little bit hazy. And Rebecca filled in some of those vital issues around what we created in the 1990s, which I think was probably the first attempt at a policy influencing academic institute, which we set up in what was Robert Maxwell's old house at Oxford Brookes University. I had been headhunted to become the first president of the World Travel and Tourism Council in 1990. And this was a group of half a dozen of the chairman and chief executives who were involved in lobbying activities in, I don't think we've ever told this story publicly, so this is the first time. And they were involved in other institutional activities of lobbying government, and they realized that travel and tourism didn't have such an entity. So they, half a dozen of them, the chairman of American Express, Jim Robinson, Paul de Bruyne from Accor and Gerard Pellisson, Colin Marshall, the chairman of Singapore Airlines, all serious players, and they wanted to create the kind of organization which I'm really happy to say WTTC seems to have become over the past 20 odd years. I was somehow got the job of the first president, and the brief was to explain to governments the size and the importance of the travel and tourism sector. And this was 1990, and it was a blank sheet of paper. They said the first job is to go and write a mission statement. I was the first employee, and they allocated a budget which was enough to pay what was a really good salary in those days. And I went away and I took this sheet of paper and I played around with this, and it was the time when they were preparing for the Rio Earth Summit. And it seemed to me that it was impossible to write a brief for the growth, supporting the growth of the sector, if you did not have in place some mechanism which also showed the other half of the coin, the impact side. And I read a lot about the Rio Earth Summit, and over time I became involved with Maurice Strong, who was the Secretary General of the Earth Summit, and in fact for the last 25 years of his life we worked closely together on some of the issues that I want to mention in the second part of what I want to talk about, which is the international tourism development. And so I started to write some pieces about travel and tourism and its impact, and I realized I knew nothing. So I turned to a friend of many people here, now deceased, Stephen Wheatcroft. And Stephen and I had done some writing together on aviation, and I said to him, look, I've got this challenge, how the hell do we deal with it? And Stephen said, Victor Middleton. He said, you need to get Victor to work with you and to help establish a concomitant side to the growth story. And I went to see Victor and met him and was impressed with his decency. I think I've been trying to think of what word can I leave you with about my relationship with Victor, my impression of Victor, and it was an impression of decency. This is a good man. This is someone who believes in what he's talking about, and it was a gentle, a different age. There were good men, Stephen Wheatcroft, Peter Masefield, Alistair Pugh. These were people who came to meetings like this with long yellow pads and wrote notes all the bloody time. And Victor and I hit it off. I said, I'd like you to do something in this field. And he said, well, we should establish some sort of a research centre. We had lots of research on the numbers that you see now. We had very good work from Wharton Econometrics, and we were able in WTTC to put those into a totally different form than they'd ever been put for before. And so if you want to know about the numbers, the same numbers that Gloria Guevara is talking about today, and I'm looking at Richard Dickinson here, he was involved at some stage, they're marginally changed. It was 10% of GDP directly and indirectly then as it is now. The growth was 1% higher than GDP then as it is now. All the rest was sort of trimmings around the edge, but we had nothing on the green side. And Victor said, I will set something up for you. I will give you my views on it. Stephen was involved, but he said, I have to have Rebecca working with me. He brought Rebecca in, and in a totally sort of unplanned and unpredicted way, we put pieces together. We were fortunate. I was in Rio. I talked to Maurice at the time and said, what can we do in order to bring at a high level? Don't forget, this was supposed to be at a high level. These chairmen wanted WTTC to be the same as the Business Council for Sustainable Development and the B team and that kind of stuff. And Maurice, I said, what can we do, Maurice, in order to do something from our sector? And he said, write a sectoral agenda, travel and tourism, Agenda 21 for travel and tourism. And I came back and spoke to Victor and Stephen and Rebecca, and we wrote together the first sectoral vision of how sustainability could become a component element. And subsequently, in talking to Maurice, he told me it was the best sectoral interpretation of Agenda 21 that had been done. And much of that credit goes to Rebecca, who did all of the legwork. Victor was a colossus in this exercise, because he brought the kind of things that David was talking about into play. He understood academia, he understood its strength and its limitations. He brought Oxford Brookes. I had no vision of Oxford Brookes as a university, and he brought the professors into play. He brought the institution into play, and he did it quietly, and he did it decently. And then at a certain stage later, in that later stage of life, when he decided to leave and go to the Lake District, he left, and we found a new director. And circumstances with that and with the evolution, WTTC got a new chairman who I fought with consistently. And at some stage, and I'm going to tell you, this is a true story, I sat down with the board and they said, this is, sorry, what does that sign say? 3 minutes remaining, okay. I sat down with the board and they said, WTTC is going great. You've got 100 members and you're doing all of the good stuff on the numbers. Everybody's using our numbers. And then one of them, and I won't say who it was, but you can imagine, an American chairman of a major airline said, just get rid of the fucking environment stuff. And that and a different director, and we lost that activity. What I wanted to talk about, and Victor was the ever-present in bringing this into our thinking and into our structure of the policy making, and into what is now the sustainability component of WTTC. And also into my own thinking that there are ways to bring academia and the business world together, but they're probably not the traditional ways. I think the traditional patterns of what goes on in the university learning world and the training world are too far apart. I think the university world is focused on writing papers, publishing, producing more papers, and the training side is focused on the weeds, teaching people the basic things, and we're missing something. And I'm working at the moment with Geoffrey in a group that he's created called T-Forum, which is trying to bring those a little bit more together. I think Victor would have liked that kind of thinking because he was a Renaissance man. He understood that you have to change. I did have a slide presentation because yesterday Ken said you should bring me some slides, and I have to confess it's the same presentation that I used this morning at an event at World Travel Market. I'm not going to show it. I'm going to leave you with, in the 2 minutes that I have remaining, with a certain thought on the international situation. I think the rest of my time on this planet is going to be spent focused on climate change. There are 1,000 other issues. There are 17 SDGs, 169 targets, 240 indicators, and there's brilliant groups everywhere doing masses of stuff on it. And the only thing that is existential is climate change. And if we don't fix that, everything else is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic because you're going to hit the iceberg. So what we're trying to do at SUNX, which stands for the Strong Universal Network, based on something Maurice Strong and I set up at the end of his life, and the X we stuck in for existential, to remind us all the time that if we don't make travel and tourism, and we're calling it climate-friendly travel. Climate-friendly travel. Think about that. It has to be positive. We had an event in New York during the first dinner celebrating Maurice Strong. We had President Calderon of Mexico there, the ex-president, thanks to Gloria Guevara brought him along. And he said, the doomsday story is right, but nobody wants to buy it. We have to craft our vision with hope. And climate-friendly travel is a vision of hope. It has to have three things. It has to be measured, the good and the bad things, and they have to be balanced, particularly the carbon emissions. It has to be green to grow. It has to cover social inclusion, the circular economy, nature-based solutions. If we don't build that into all our tourism, we'll miss where society's going. And it has to be 2050 proof. It has to keep a vision of how do we get over time our carbon emissions to be zero and our greenhouse gas, it's not just carbon, it's the other stuff, the sulfur, the methane, and how do we get those to be zero? It's not enough for the airlines to say we can't do it, they have to do it. If they don't do it, they shouldn't be able to fly. Greta Thunberg is right in that sense. Greta Thunberg is right that we shouldn't be polluting to levels that we know are going to cause the catastrophic, the destruction of the Bahamas, of Dominica, and the continuing permanent threat of these things. So we have to change our vision of what travel and tourism will be like going forward. And the airlines have to spend money on finding a synthetic fuel. It's the only long-term solution, is to stop using fossil fuel. And they say it's difficult and it's more expensive. It's an input factor. The prices have to go up. That'll help with over-tourism. It's changing our way of thinking. Victor Middleton was a person who imbued that kind of thinking in me, who said that you have to take yourself out of the box and look for differing kinds of solutions. And I mean, we are going to try to do this with SunX. We've got a wonderful relationship with the government of Malta, who are providing sustained funding for this. We've got programs for learning, programs for education of kids. We've got some cartoons starting in school, 65 cartoons for kids about how they have to change their thinking about travel, which have been shown on French television. We're going to do some university courses. And we believe that the sector has to change because it is fundamental to humanity. It's interwoven into almost everything that we do. But it can only do it if it does what the rest of humanity has committed to do under the Paris Agreement, which is to be a zero carbon sector by 2050. And that's a long time. That's 30 years in the future, is the same as 50 years going back because of the accelerating pace of time. There is time to do it, but it won't come with any of us in this room. It'll come with the next generation. And that's why the education component is such a fundamental part, and that's why the Victor Middletons of this world are the people who have to help shape that future. Thank you.
We move on to a topic which concerns a lot of us in the audience, which is tourism consultancy. Tom Buncle is going to speak on consultancy. Tom runs Yellow Railroad Limited, an international consultancy which helps destinations improve their competitiveness through branding, marketing, destination management planning and crisis recovery. Tom was previously Chief Executive of Visit Scotland and worked for Visit Britain in the USA, Canada, Norway, London and Singapore. Tom.
Thanks, Roger. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I just say I am honoured to be invited to this event to commemorate the giant, the guru of our sector, Victor Middleton, to talk on a subject about which I know very little. And the reason I think many of you in the audience know far more about the historic trajectory of tourism consultancy than I do. Unlike many of you, many of the speakers and many of the people in the room, I only got to know Victor later in life. And I think we clicked pretty well immediately. I saw in Victor what many people had seen. I'd heard in reverential tones when anybody spoke about him for years before I'd met him. Rigorous intellect, great wisdom, and a real ability to get to the core of any argument, and probably the best bullshit detector of anyone in the business. So I like to think we became friends, and we actually, until a couple of days before he died from his hospital bed, we were working on a paper to go to government to lobby for the need for destination management, because our view was that governments are recalcitrant all over the world, NTOs are, DMOs are, because as has been said many times, it's all about marketing, and management has been talked about but largely ignored. And I think that was the measure of Victor, who said to me, he sent me an email, he said, don't worry, he said, I'm in hospital, keep sending me the information, and we edited this paper until very shortly before his death. Can I also say that I think we're all very glad that Deb has been able to make it down here from the Lake District and hear these wonderful accolades to Victor from his friends, colleagues, and fans. And there are many, many fans around the world that he has that know of him, even if they haven't met him. So what I'm going to talk about just now is tourism consultancy. Is it a gold mine or is it a busted flush? But really a helicopter view over the last 50 years and a crystal ball peek into the next 5. And maybe I better switch this on to make it work. Yeah, got it. So I've really sectioned it in 3. This could be a pretty dry subject, so I thought I'd take a musical theme. There's no music, but a musical theme, starting with Dylan from Like a Rolling Stone. What does it mean to be on your own, which many of us as consultants are nowadays, which is the definition. The long and winding road, which is the last 50 years since the development of Tourism Act, and coincidentally since the launch of that very song by the Beatles, and then the times they are changing, back to Dylan and looking at the future. I'm going to look at it from 3 perspectives: from the consultant's perspective, from the client's perspective, and from the perspective of the funding bodies or users of consultancies. So let's just look, before we go on, let's just think how remarkable the progress has been in the last 50 years. I mean, we had landed men on the moon 50 years ago. But, what are our entrepreneurial brains looking at now? What challenges of science, technology, and commerce are they applying themselves to 50 years later? Can you read that? Anyway, let's move on. We have been described, I think, by people as the last refuge of snake oil salesmen, carpetbaggers, and charlatans, or are we indeed an invaluable source of global expertise? Well, I'm sure many of us have been accused of this, someone who steals your watch and tells you the time. And the very first project I did was in Northern Ireland, and the very first director that I interviewed, because I thought that's what you did as a consultant, you go and talk to people to learn about their business, just said to me, all you'll do is steal our watch and tell us the time. And I thought, oh God, he's right. And then I thought and said, but if I can't hand it back to you with such panache that you go, oh my God, is that the time already? Then I've failed. And I think, okay, there's an element of truth in that, but I like to think we add a lot more value. There's also this great definition of an economic consultant, someone who draws a straight line from an unwarranted assumption to a foregone conclusion. And I have to warn you now, I said historically the trajectory, many of you will know more than I do about consultancy. So this is a rather subjective, provocative, and perhaps not fully formed view. But what I would say in terms of definition of consultancy, I like to think that the characteristics are professional integrity, that we bring expertise and experience that organisations don't have, and we are independent and we are discreet, most of us anyway, until we get into the pub. But why do businesses use a consultant? Well, I think there's a number. One, because they don't have the specialist knowledge that consultants do have. So that's why we're brought in. I think that's actually the best use of a consultant, and it's probably the least use of a consultant. There are others that bring in fresh thinking, that organisations get stale. More legs. They maybe know the answers to all the questions, they just don't have enough people to do it. So we're brought in just as extras. And then the value of independent endorsement. It's a prophet in his own land message. How many times can you go to your board and try and persuade them of a an argument that they disagree with. Much easier to bring in a consultant who brings an independent perspective. And I'm not being cynical there, but bringing an independent perspective is valuable and important, and very often helpful to the business. And finally, sometimes just playing the bad cop to the organisation's good cop. And at this point, you're probably all saying, well, how many consultants does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is only one, but they'll never switch it on. Why not? Because we consultants don't implement anything. So, well, sometimes we do, as you'll see in a minute. Anyway, just a bit of a distraction. Looking at the last 50 years, the long and winding road, doing the research for this, I discovered, which I didn't know, and I worked for BTA, British Tourist Authority, many years ago, there was the Travel Association of Great Britain and Ireland, not Northern Ireland, but Ireland, had opened offices in the 1930s in Buenos Aires first, I think, then Paris, New York, and Amsterdam. So we tend to think of the beginning of what we know as the tourism era as starting in roughly 1969. But just, it's quite savage to think that they were thinking like that then. And that's one of the offices in Paris. So I've, as I say, subjectively, provocatively, and not completely, developed a sort of trajectory of the history of, as I see it, of the 6 eras of tourism consultancy. BTE is before the tourism era, which is not really, but we're thinking of the Tourism Act in '69. So I've characterised that as the era of the pioneers, the individuals, the Victor Middletons, who gradually got tourism to be seen as a sector, as an economic driver. And I think a lot of the business around then, and hopefully there will be argument about this later, because it's just my view, but it seemed to be largely specialist hospitality, planning, architects, that sort of thing. And then we got to the era of the big beasts, the big five, the PwCs, the Ernst & Youngs, and so on. When tourism sort of consultancy kind of went mainstream and was seen as a commercial opportunity, and a lot of people fed very well off that, particularly the big businesses, the big consultancies. And that then took us more into the area, broad area, I think, of destination development and master planning and that sort of thing. And then the era of expansion, when the little people, the SMEs and the individuals started to get involved. And we then went to the era of procurement around here. And I just want to read that for a second. John Glenn, as I hurtled through space, one thought kept crossing my mind: every part of this rocket was supplied by the lowest bidder. So that was the era of procurement. Then I think we had the era of the long knives, which was when supply of consultants started to exceed the demand for them. There was greater competition. It's when the RDAs, the regional development agencies, were abolished. A lot of the bigger funding organisations were abolished, and that churned out a lot of individuals into the marketplace who competed with the rest of us. So the supply grew, the demand was restricted, and there was greater competition. As a result, fees started to get squeezed. And now, then we moved into the era of austerity, when there was even less of this work around, particularly, and we're talking largely, I am talking largely about public sector funded destination stuff. There's lots of other private sector tourism consulting, which we can talk about later, but that's what I'm focusing on here. And I would say that's also characterised by ad hocery. I mean, take the British industrial strategy for a start. It's not a strategy, it's a bunch of bits where people pick pork barrel, really, ideas about what can we spend this money on and that money on. There is no strategy. So it's very ad hoc, and we're not alone in that. And then we sort of go into, I think, the area of more back to specialist consultancy. And tourism at consultancy, I think, is now much more a niche business where you have a specialism, and I will say more about that in just a second. And I think, so where are we going in the future from 2020 onwards? Ken and I talked about this, and this is one of the thoughts we had. We're more likely to see associations of self-help groups, communities of mutual interest who might be doing stuff on their own that they might otherwise have paid consultants to do. But one thing I want to say here is, this is a rather narrow term of tourism consultancy. It covers a vast range of other areas, from, as Rebecca and I were talking, placemaking to food to architecture to lots of stuff to do with tourism. And I should say, when we're talking about tourism, I should pay respect to Victor and say, actually, Victor was always saying it's not tourism, it's the visitor economy, which describes in much better and more fuller detail what we're really talking about. So it is a rather narrow perspective at the moment. But let's look at it from the point of view of the funders. We as consultants need to follow the money. Who were and are the big funders? Well, BTA Visit Britain, I think their funding was not so much for the tourism consultants who are in this room, but was much more about outsourcing, advertising, digital, PR, research, those kind of specialist technical things. But then you had the other national tourist boards as they were and as they morphed over these years, and the metropolitan and community councils and the local authorities were big. And this was a big period of tourism consultancy. Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and I'm looking mostly here at the UK. Welsh Government, the RDAs lasted a very short period of time. Then you had the LEPs, the local enterprise partnerships, which are really not, they don't have money, they're in the business of bidding for money. And then other large organisations such as non-departmental public bodies, National Trust, National Parks, and internationally, the NGOs, the World Bank, the African, Asian, American, Caribbean, development banks, European Union, USAID, etc. These are all people who have used consultancy in different ways, but I think the heyday was around here in the 80s, 90s, when there were big master plans and strategies called for. There was a good amount of funding about, and there were fewer consultants around. And this is where we've sort of got to now, I think, which is a funding drought, austerity, a decline in demand because of that, to a degree. There are many more consultants because there are lots of good people who've been working in these organisations, who've been made redundant, competing with each other. So we have more consultants and more ad hocery, small jobs. But that's enough of the past. Let's have a quick look at the future. You'll all remember Michael Gove saying this. Was that the final nail in our coffin? No, I don't think so. But I think where it's going to go is, I think we're going to see much more demand for niche consultancy, specialist skills, to fill the skills gaps that these organisations don't have. I think those are going to be much more technical skills, such as planners, architects, digital. And I think we're going to see more demand for us to fill the gaps in implementation and actually do the job. You know, can you run a campaign for us? Can you do a product development for us, rather than a large strategy or master plan? Now, I have absolutely no evidence of this because I'm talking about the future, but it's just a sort of feeling that I smell in the air. I think locally we'd like to see more short-term contracts run by individuals rather than the bigger companies, but internationally I suspect those few large projects, because the aid money has disappeared as well, largely, there will be more large projects, I think, or the projects that there are likely to be larger and likely to need multi-skilled teams. So what about aspiring? Let me see if we've got any aspiring consultants in the audience, because we get asked this a lot. And the thing is, how do we become a consultant? The thing I keep saying is you need experiences. You can't start being a consultant like you can start becoming an architect. There isn't a recognised way in. So go out, subcontract your services to existing consultants who are getting the work. Develop your own area of expertise. And once you have that, then define what your distinctive skills are, what your experience is. And then network and communicate that experience, because there's no point saying, I do everything, because when you hear that, you say, well, that means nothing. But if you say, I'm an expert in underwater basket weaving and I speak Kazakhstani, well, then you may never work. But at least you're defining what you can do, and we as consultants who are looking to make up teams will notice that much more. So in summary, the trends seem to be, to me, there's a move from general to specialist consultancy needs, from strategy to implementation by consultants. There's less money around, therefore fewer projects. Expectations are pretty high, fees are pretty low. We've gone from the era of word of mouth, getting jobs word of mouth, to fairly convoluted procurement systems. And the positive, I have been pretty gloomy, I admit, but the positive side, I've tried to be honest. The positive here might be that with the declining supply and fewer entrants is there a greater opportunity for those people who are there now, the younger people who are coming in now, to get those jobs in the future? And the other thing, which we've had some discussion, it's a pretty stale, pale male setup in the consultancy world. And I'm not saying this is happening, but it needs to happen. We need to be more diverse. So, and this is a final thought I just want to leave you with, and I'll let you read that for a second before I tell you a story. So, in finishing, let me tell you a story about a Scottish, or a consultant coming home from a project in the Scottish Highlands. And he got stuck in a Highlands traffic jam, which was a flock of sheep being herded home to the farm, at the back of which was a farmer on his quad bike. And as he was lost, and as the farmer came level with him on his quad bike, the consultant leant out the window and he said, can you tell me where I am? I'm completely lost. And he said, the farmer said, yeah, you're 17 miles from Ullapool. And he said, well, thank you very much. He said, the farmer said, well, but I bet you something. He said, I bet you'll get lost at least twice more on the way back to Inverness. So the consultant said, so you're a betting man, are you? He said, yes. He said, well, how about this? He said, if I can tell you how many sheep you have in your flock, can I have one of them? And he said, well, certainly. So he got out his satellite phone, logged on to Google Sheep View, and then quickly said, you have 344 sheep here, and there are 2 behind. And the farmer said, that's brilliant. Well, I'm impressed. He said, take your pick. So with some difficulty, he got one of the beasts and stuck it in the back of the car. And the farmer said, hang on a minute, he said, I can see you're a betting man yourself. He said, if I can tell you what you do for a job, he said, can I have my beast back? If I can't, you can have the whole flock. So the consultant said, yeah, no problem. And the farmer said, well, he said, you are obviously a consultant. He said, you're obviously a management consultant. And he said, how do you know that? He said, well, you come along here uninvited. You have no idea where you are or where you're going. You know nothing about my business. You offer to answer a question to which I already know the answer, and you want to be paid for it. He said, now, give me back my dog. Thank you very much.
We finish our presentations with a topic that involves us all, technology in tourism. And we're very lucky to have a distinguished speaker who just this morning was talking to a very large crowd at the World Travel Market. Paul Richer is senior partner of the world's leading independent travel technology consultancy, Genesis Digital Transformation, which he founded nearly 25 years ago. Paul chairs most of the European digital travel conferences and is generally to be found at this time of year running exceptionally informative technology sessions at the World Travel Market, so we're delighted that he's been able to make himself available for this event. Paul.
Thank you, and thank you for Tom for turning on the thing here. I'm delighted to be here with so many... Can you hear me at the back? Good, lovely. I'm delighted to be here with so many tourism luminaries, fantastic. And Roger, thank you for inviting me. It's very kind. And I'm talking about technology. We don't need to know about me, we've been there, done that. And I never had the chance to meet Victor at all, so I did a bit of research. And as has been mentioned, I saw he'd written this book, Marketing in Travel and Tourism. 4 editions, I think, starting 1988 and finishing 2009, is that right? So I thought I would use the starting point of 1988 to talk a bit about technology. And I think it's been mentioned just before, technology is, the pace of change of technology is ever increasing. So what we might have done in the last 50 years, we'll be doing in the next 2 or 3 years, and those 2 or 3 years will probably be the next 6 months. The pace of change is ever increasing. And I thought I'd start back in 1988, when Victor wrote his first book, and maybe come up to the present day. And I just realised while I was sitting here that in 1988 I bought my first PC. Did anyone else buy a PC in 1988? I was on my MBA then, and we had to type up our little business case study things. And I bought this Amstrad computer which cost £1,000, and £1,000 was big money in 1988. And it had a hard drive of 20 megabytes. My phone here hasn't got a full memory, but it's got 3,000 times the storage capacity of that. And for those who like these statistics, I upgraded the memory to 640 kilobytes. And this is at Cranfield. We had this lovely bit of torture when on Friday night you'd be given a case study, and you had to hand in a 1,500 word written analysis of the case study by 9 p.m. on Saturday night. So you'd go away, read it, you'd actually meet in your little study group, then you get typing. And one of my fellows, about 8:30 or so, he finished his 1,500 word case study, and he said, you know what, I'll just move my computer, my Amstrad, from here to here. And in those days, you would crash a hard drive doing that, you had to park it, and he lost his whole work. Very sad. But I thought I'd start right at the beginning there. And in 1991, 1993, we were looking at the first web page, first web browsers. They weren't commercially available then, but I think I actually downloaded Netscape, the very first web browser in, where are we, 92 or so, something like that. And in those days, for you youngsters, you won't know this, we actually used something called a modem. Yeah, a modulator, demodulator. This was something that you plugged into your phone line, it went beep, beep, boop, 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 and you'd connect up to the internet at a speed of, the early ones were about 9,600 kilobits per second. Not megabits, not gigabits, kilobits, very old stuff. And I was actually on the first British Telecom ADSL, that's broadband trial, in probably 96 or so, 95, 96, where we were running at 1.5 megabits per second. And this was like heaven. It was fantastic. You could download some software in under an hour, which was unheard of. So that was nice. Around about that time, I think in 95, I was asked by British Telecom to actually come along to one of their big gatherings of, 500,000 account managers, huge number. This is British Telecom. None of them had ever seen the internet, they'd never seen the web, and they wanted someone to talk about the World Wide Web and demonstrate that you could do things like book a British Midland flight online in less than 20 minutes. I mean, it was fantastic, only just less than 20 minutes. So I was demonstrating I dialed up on my modem through a very reliable BT line, and I was demonstrating how you can browse the web, and I showed a few nice, interesting websites. And then the head salesperson said, "Okay, Paul, why don't you show us all the Playboy website?" I said, I don't think I can do that. You know, there's women in the audience. I'm not sure this is a great thing to do. No, don't be silly, he said. Just come on. You know, we're all friends together. Thankfully, my modem fell over, and it never happened. He would probably be thrown in prison nowadays to actually make that suggestion. So we had ADSL, broadband, arriving in 97, which suddenly opened up the internet. None of this dial-up business. We could actually do things commercially. And the first iPod came along in 2001. Who had an early iPod? You know, you can sell them for good money on eBay nowadays. They're all collector's items. They're worth quite a lot of money, so look after it. They're like precious antiques. Come on, you can do it. You can't do it, okay. Aha! There we go, a little delay, but we're there. So moving on to the late noughties. And with 3G launched, suddenly we were able to have the internet in our pocket. And this opened up the era of social media. And I remember getting my Facebook page, and my kids told my wife, "You know, you've got to be on Facebook. That's a place to be." So she subscribed to this website, and she started getting emails from men who wanted to date her and take her out. And my daughter said, "What did you subscribe to? Facebook?" "Oh, no, I subscribed to FaceTime or something else." She'd actually picked up the wrong website there. She'd actually subscribed to a dating website. But we could actually get through the era of social media, which we all take for granted now, but was very exciting at the time. Oh, there we go. And now moving up to the 2010s, 4G was launched. Isn't that nice? Every now and then, if you're in a good reception area, you can get your mobile phone to work fast. It's great. And I think 2013, the first Wi-Fi kettle. Hands up who's got a Wi-Fi kettle. No, I'm not sure why you'd want one. I think the idea was actually to get the kettle boiling while you're still in bed. And you can send the wife down and do it, or the husband. It works both ways. It does work both ways. I said wife because I like to watch bed. Nothing sexist. We had our first Apple Watch Series 1 there. I bought Series 2. I'm now on a Series 4. And the first domestic voice devices. And we've probably all got voice devices at home now. And I don't know about you, but I'm getting very, very used to using voice now. It's a very useful interface. If I say, hey Siri, multiply 2 by 4. Oh, it timed out, but we know the answer. It does work. Now then it does work. So there we are. And now it's getting a bit more exciting. We're actually in the age of artificial intelligence, 2019 and onwards. And artificial intelligence is being driven now by massive computing power. I mean, huge processing power and unlimited data storage capabilities. We're in the world of artificial intelligence, which is very handy. I'll tell you why in a minute. We've got 5G rolling out. Anyone got a 5G mobile phone yet? They're very short range. I'm not optimistic about 5G, but it will be as fast on your mobile phone as the fastest broadband you could have at home. So you could be actually streaming movies on your phone. Why do you want to do that? I don't know. So here's my iPhone. That's actually my iPhone with all my icons on it, so you can see the kind of things that I do with my iPhone. And too far. Let me go back one. Sorry. There we are. That's just my home screen. I've got about another 4 pages of icons. So yeah, I've got my calendar, my diary. I do a bit of photography. The Internet of Things. I've got a lot of home control at the moment. I can check my heating and play around with that. I can turn the sprinkler, the watering system off in the garden and stuff like that. Oh, you all do this. I know it's nothing new. Google search. I can get my car to heat up in the morning before I get into it. I can find my way. I can send messages to people. That's quite handy. I can be sociable. I can entertain myself. I can check the weather. I did check. I think it's going to be raining when we leave. And I can shop. The world now is at our fingertips. And we all think it's marvellous. And Generation Z and Generation A to follow, maybe Gen Y, they all just take this for granted. They've never known anything different. This is their world. My 3 kids, they're not that young. My oldest is 30, my youngest is 25. One, if they wants to talk to me, texts me. One will actually Facebook message me, and the other will use WhatsApp. And every few months I might get a verbal, voice communication. But kids are getting very used to actually communicating by messaging. I might come to that a bit later. So, are we suffering from device management overload? That's the question. And I'm actually very positive about artificial intelligence in that it can actually help shape your life and help you make your life less hectic. Those marketing people here will know that if you've got a consumer who wants to make a choice and buy something, offer them 2 or 3 choices and they'll choose something and be very happy. Offer them 10 or 12 choices and they're completely befuddled and they'll walk away. And I think that's what AI does for us. So relevance is the new easy, because if you're being tracked, if your every movement online is known, the websites you're going to, your travelling preferences, then actually artificial intelligence can make life relevant to you. So you'll see on the left here, that's Amazon giving me recommendations based on my purchasing habits. In the middle, that's mapping, telling me to know where I might like to go next. And over on Netflix, because I watched this, I like that. So actually, relevance is the new easy, and easy is the new loyalty for everyone. And if you think about that, I'll give you an example for myself. If I'm shopping, I just buy everything on Amazon now. I'm so lazy, I don't go to shops anymore. If my printer toner cartridge runs low, I get Amazon on my mobile, I scan the barcode and click buy, and it's done. It's so easy. If you want to get a cab, you don't want to lift your hand up anymore. That's very old-fashioned. Much better just to click the button, get an Uber to come to you, and you might get it cheaper than a black cab. And I feel sorry for the black cab industry, but that's the way it is. Easy is a new loyalty. So if you're in the business of running loyalty schemes, etc., don't bother. Actually make your business so easy to do business with that people are happy to be there, which might have implications for tourism. Think about that. So tourism's developed in ways that maybe in 1988 we weren't even thinking about. That's, I think, second edition of the book. I thought it was first edition. I think it's second edition, actually. And we've talked about virtual reality. I'm not a great believer in VR. Hands up who's got a television that has a 3D capability. Well, you see, you don't even know. A TV you bought where you put on little glasses and, no? They were all the rage, nobody bothered with them because they were too much trouble. And I think that's a problem with VR today. The only issue, yeah, we'll come to the future, Geoffrey, in a minute. The only issue is hearing Geoffrey speak and Rebecca speak. It sounds as though we're going to have not enough tourism space for all the tourists who want to actually visit the tourism venues. So I assume that big tourism destinations like the Vatican and the like actually limit supply or limit the number of tourists can visit. You have to buy time tickets, and that's the same in quite a few tourism destinations now. So you can imagine if you take that to the economic consequences of that kind of tourism rationing that maybe you were both touching on in the future. You can imagine that actually tourism destinations on economic supply and demand might push their prices up, and tourism, live tourism, becomes a privilege of the wealthy, just like it was at the turn of the 20th century, when it wasn't easy to travel, it was expensive. And maybe we're going to be over-tourist in the world, and so supply and demand actually might drive up the price of tourism. Something to think about. I had Barry Kelly speak at one of my seminars today at World Travel Market. He's Chief Executive of Visit Greenwich. And he put a few slides up because I asked, my seminar's called The Future of Digital Travel. And I asked them to think about what's happening in Greenwich. So I thought I'd look at a few of his slides. Yes, he's got a great economic impact, a great employment impact. He reckons his tourism area is adding 40 million to the local economy per annum, doing very well for himself. And his aspiration is to become a smart destination, to enhance the customer experience through every touch point along the customer journey. And you've seen the customer journey, here's one. This will be better in the circle because it starts with social and ends in social. But you get inspired, possibly by social media, through friends, through reviews. You start searching online for some things that might suit you. You book something. You actually, on property or in destination, you should be using social media if you're a destination that's encouraging that, to actually your tourists become your advocates. And they're actually saying how what a great time they're having. One of my speakers today, Daniel Wishnia from around town, was asked a question. He's very much into imaging. There was a lady in the audience who runs a restaurant, and she said, how can I get people to promote me on social media? He said, what you need to do in your restaurant, you need a selfie corner. This will be an area that has maybe the most beautiful looking foods or some wonderful decorations that everybody wants to stand there and take their photos with your food, and that's how you'll promote yourself. Actually, destinations are very good at this because you have photo spots that prefer places to stand. So that's the customer journey that Barry was talking about. And he saw the future of getting online planning and booking right, getting real-time patching distribution right, and those other things as well. Let's just quickly go through them, because I know we're tight on time. I've talked about voice. The people in the transport industry are very excited about voice. Book a flight to Paris on Virgin Atlantic on the 5th of November at 21:30. That's very fast. And we have the technology to do that. But it doesn't actually show the beauty of our tourism destinations very well. It's a voice piece of technology, so it's not great for tourism. And yet, you've got to understand that travel and tourism is actually information. At the point of sale, it is just information. It doesn't exist. Eventually, the tourist or traveller will get there, but when they're researching it, looking at it, booking it, it's just information on a computer. So it lends itself to the internet. Real-time packaging and distribution. This is a diagram from TXGB. People heard of TXGB? This is a Visit England initiative, isn't it? A travel exchange. I remember the consultancy I used to work for back in the early 90s. We were trying to do this without the internet existing. And we were going to use big tandem non-stop computers. Our big issue was getting out to the small product suppliers, the small bed and breakfast and the like. The only way they could possibly communicate was with fax machine, but they didn't even have that, so that failed. In '95, I did some work with British Telecom on an electronic transport marketplace. They were going to put kiosks and stations and banks and bits and pieces. They were going to unite the transport infrastructure of Great Britain through the ETM. I did a feasibility study, it didn't work. So I hope this will work. I'm not optimistic. I remember some people getting some at the start of the internet. I did some work with some very entrepreneurial hoteliers who got £5 million of funding to start up a travel marketplace. Great big marketplace where everyone come in. Not dissimilar to this. It didn't happen. So but I'm optimistic for this one. I hope TXGB does actually happen. And down at Greenwich, they've realised they've got to have a better digital infrastructure. They've got to make sure the Wi-Fi's there so the social media addicts can actually promote Greenwich and all the beautiful things that they can see there. And I'm a great believer in augmented reality. That bottom shot is a lovely recreation of how Greenwich would have looked in 1637. Now imagine the fun you can have if you're holding up your phone, looking at Greenwich on your phone, and through augmented reality you can actually move around and see how Greenwich used to be. I'm a great believer in augmented reality and tourism. And I think a good example of something that didn't take off was do you remember Google Glass? The little Google spectacles that you could wear? That would have been a nice bit of augmented reality technology. So, just to close, I'd like to say, Victor was at the forefront of tourism, and I think amongst some of the most exciting times we've ever had, but I don't think we've seen anything yet. More to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. We have quite considerably overrun our time, so we will cut the discussion panel time down to about half an hour. If anyone... Well, I would suggest we maybe have 3 minutes break. If you want a comfort break, go out the door and it's downstairs. If you wish to pick up a glass of wine while you're listening to the panel, please do so now as the panel take their seats. And we're going to try to get this screen to go up. Rebecca, do you know how to switch this off? We really want to get that.
I have to go in the not too distant future.